Welcome to our Sound for Video session. Today is the 16th of July, 2019, and it's a question and answer session. We're going to go ahead and jump in and cover a number of questions that were sent in ahead of time, and then if you're logged on and at the live session here, you'll be able to leave some questions in the chat there, and we'll get those as well. So let's first of all go ahead and get these questions that were sent in ahead of time. First question is from Brad, and some of my windows are in the way here. Let me just get them out of the way. Apologize here. There we go. The pointer disappears, so what I need to do is move all this stuff. Apologies there. Okay, back in. There we go. All right, first is a question from Brad. What is your process for setting levels on someone in a professional setting like a corporate video, someone who isn't an actor and likely isn't comfortable being on video? I want to be quick and not make things awkward or distracting for the person who is already uncomfortable, but also accurately dial them in. I also find that people don't speak at their normal volume when doing a sound check. Yes, that is a common thing for non-actors, sometimes even for actors, is that you can kind of start to engage them and ask them questions and things of that nature. And a lot of times they will use a talking voice that is either quieter or louder, depending on the person, usually quieter. And then as soon as you start rolling, they start to, at least if they're good at, or sorry, not good at, but at least if they're experienced presenters, a lot of times I find they'll start projecting more, they'll talk louder. So what I typically do is, you're right, in the sound check, that's always a challenge. But what I do is often, if it's a scripted piece where they have lines that they're going to speak, which a lot of times in corporate video, we do have something like that. Or even if we don't, what I'll have them do is say, hey, we're just going to do a quick dry run through this. Because I also happen to be the director in this case too. So I have this kind of latitude to do this. So I'm going to have you do a dry run and just go ahead and talk through your first few lines. Or if there is an interview and there's a different interviewer, or even if I'm interviewing them, I'll ask them the first question. And I'll go ahead and start recording, and I'll be watching my levels there, and I may adjust the gain from there. So that's typically how I do it. I kind of trick them into thinking they're just doing a dry run. If the take is good, we'll just use that. And I'll just tell them, hey, that was perfect. So we're just going to go ahead and use that. And usually, if they're in agreement, then we're good to go. But if they're not, and they do change the loudness of their voice overall, then at least you have kind of a scratch take where you could adjust the gain trim from there. So that's generally what I do, Brad. I hope that helps a little bit. Next up from Sean, a while back, you did a quick comparison between a cardioid and a hypercardioid microphone for indoor recording based on the idea that the pickup pattern of a plain cardioid, although not the standard, might pick up less reverb than a hypercardioid. The cardioid mic in your test did seem clearer. Have you since used cardioid mics for indoor recordings or recommend it? There's kind of a special case there. Let me talk about that. And actually, there's a second question from Jeff, which is very similar. I notice on polar charts, the hyper and supercardioid patterns have rear lobes of sensitivity, which means they actually pick up some from behind them, whereas cardioids don't. Why are super and hypercardioids suggested for indoor dialogue use when their rear lobes could pick up reverberance versus cardioid that would ostensibly not pick that up since it has no rear pattern? These are both great questions. They're related, so I'm going to go ahead and go through them at the same time. I think cardioids are perfectly fine to use indoors. Generally, I find you have to get them a little bit closer, so they don't have as much reach. That is because the lobe, or the pickup pattern on the front, is a little bit wider. It will pick up a little bit more on the sides here, versus a supercardioid or hypercardioid, which will pick up a little bit less on the sides here and then be a little bit more directional, but it will pick up a little bit on the back of the mic. So there's a trade-off there. Everything is a trade-off in this profession. So here's my thinking. You're going to pick up reverb regardless of whether you use a cardioid, a supercardioid, or a hypercardioid if you're working in a very reverberant space. Period. That's just going to happen. And it doesn't matter whether it's picking it up on the back or on the sides. Again, it's just a trade-off as to where it's picking it up. So as I go back and listen to that test, I'm not sure I hear a massive difference, but if you feel like you want to use a cardioid, that's perfectly fine. Use what works best for your situation. However, what I'm finding in my guess as to the reasoning for why most production sound mixers will use a supercardioid microphone when they're booming indoors is that you have what is called a little more reach. And what that technically means is that the polar pattern on the front is a little bit narrower, which means that you can move the microphone back a little bit, and this part at least is still going to be a little bit more focused. And yes, you will pick up some reverb, for example, on the back, but it's a trade-off that's worth making if you have to, for example, move that microphone a little farther away. So that's my understanding of why typically supercardioids are used indoors by most production sound mixers. So there's some thoughts for you, and hope that makes some sense. Now, as far as reverb is concerned, really the solution to reverb is getting sound blankets up in the room as much as possible. So that's probably the better solution in most cases for reverb and managing reverb. So there's some thoughts there. Those are great questions. I'm glad you asked those. Next up from Kevin, what are the best settings for this and what do they each do? So let me give you some context here. So what you're seeing here is the match loudness window from Adobe Audition. And so the question is, if I'm going to loudness normalize my audio clips, what do each of these settings mean? Well, let me run through that. First of all, the very top one is the loudness standard that you're using. So, for example, in the United States, ITU-RBS 1770-3 loudness is the standard we use for television broadcast. And so if you use that dropdown and select that, the first three settings are set for you, and you should leave them there. That's going to be, if you're trying to hit this target, that's going to be 19, and actually it looks like it was changed on this particular screenshot to -19. But normally that's going to say -23. And the loudness, I believe the loudness tolerance and the true peak are correct there, but they may have been changed too, I'm not sure. In any case, I would leave them at the defaults if you're trying to match that loudness target. And then the look ahead time and the release time refer to the true peak limiter. So when you raise those levels, all the samples come up by the same amount. And if anything gets up close to 0, these settings will actually help determine how it limits those transients and those peaks on the waveform. So it'll look ahead. They're very similar basically to compression settings. So compressor settings. The look ahead time, I'm not 100% certain, but I believe that is similar to attack. I think it has to do with how quickly this peak limiter engages. Not 100% on that, but that's my understanding. And then the release time is very much like the release time on a compressor. How long it, after the signal goes down below the threshold again, which in this case is a -1.5 dB true peak. Once it goes down below that, how long it takes before the limiter disengages. So that's what those settings mean. Now, in most cases, I would just choose the loudness standard. So there's an EBUR 128 for European broadcast television, and that's going to have a slightly different target loudness, but most of the settings are going to be pretty similar. So I would just leave them at those defaults and then adjust the target loudness. For example, if you're going to be publishing something to the web, that's where I would just adjust the target loudness. I'd leave everything else the same. So there's a quick run through at a very high level with what each of those means. So let me just we didn't talk about the first three. So let's talk about the first three again as well. So target loudness is the target you're trying to hit, the overall loudness target you're trying to hit. And this is measured in a more sophisticated way than most peak peak meters. And it's also more sophisticated than just an RMS measure of the entire audio clip. It's actually taking into account all of the sound that sits above a certain threshold and factoring that into its calculation of overall how loud something is. Now, it's important to remember that loudness really, for human hearing, has to do with not only amplitude, but time that the waveform is at that amplitude. So the big spikes don't necessarily sound super loud unless they're sustained. Then they start to sound really loud to us as humans. So it's doing some calculations there to measure that overall loudness. That's what that's doing. Tolerance is how much room you're giving the algorithm to miss the target by just a little bit. And, so if, for example, the target loudness and the max true peak limiter or the max true peak level, those can kind of compete against each other. If you're trying to get a certain loudness level and also maintain a certain true peak headroom, those are it's kind of a back and forth, and they have to compete with each other a little bit potentially. And so what the tolerance does is it says, hey, I'll give you 5 or 0.5 loudness units to kind of, you know, you can fudge one of them to meet the other one is basically what that is. So typically you want to leave that at 0.5. And then the max true peak level is when, for the peaks, you never want them to go higher than minus 1.5 dB true peak. Now, what that means is there's the possibility that all of the samples could be below minus 1.5 dB full scale, but it's possible in the real world for the line, if you were to draw an imaginary line between each of the samples, for an inter-sample peak to go higher than minus 1.5. That's kind of a, it's a little bit mind-bending, but basically it's a surefire way to make sure that you're not going to clip. Because even if you set your peak, if you use a limiter and you peak limit to minus 1 dB, it's still possible technically for on playback, once the samples get converted to analog, for there to be some clipping, because between two samples, the waveform could actually go up and hit or go beyond 0. So there's some thoughts on that and what those mean. So thank you, Kevin, for that question. Next up from Alejandro, my question is regarding the time code for my Zoom F8. I'm happy to announce I recently purchased a used ambient nano locket. One thing I know, so that's a time code generator for those that are not familiar with it. It's actually wireless one, which is kind of cool. So you can, if you have multiple of the nano lockets, you can push a button and it will jam sync all of them wirelessly. Pretty cool. One thing I noticed was it only came with the LEMO to 3.5 millimeter connection cable, which is what I was expecting. So that is to say, he's got a cable that will connect with a LEMO connector to the nano locket, and the other end is a 3.5 millimeter TRS cable that would go typically into like a DSLR or a microphone input on a camera that has a 3.5 millimeter microphone input. I saw quite a few cables on the ambient recording site, and to be honest, I was quite overwhelmed by the amount of them. So before I purchase either 2 or 3 more nano lockets, I would like to know which appropriate cables to use for the Zoom F8 and which cables to get for the Sony cameras, Canon C300, Blackmagic Ursa, or the Pocket camera, the Alexa Mini, and finally the Red cameras. Basically, it sounds like you have to get one of each based on what you're saying here. One other thing I found a bit confusing was some of the cables were in and out, and others were out or simply just in. So they can be unidirectional. Some of the cables can only go one direction. So that's important to know. This could be, let me just pull up the website here. All right, for those that are watching here, so you can see we have a whole bunch of different options here. This is probably the cable right here that came with your nano locket. This is the LEMO to 3.5 millimeter TRS. So that's going to work for most DSLRs or camcorders that have 3.5 millimeter inputs or things like that. For the Pocket, the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera, that will work on that one, the one that came with your nano locket. So you're good on that one. For the Blackmagic and the Zoom, for the Blackmagic Ursa and the Zoom, you need a BNC connector. And so, and it actually, when we get to the Red cameras, that's complicated too because there are a variety of different options. This is one, I think really probably your best bet, Alejandro. If you can call someone like B&H or in your whatever country you're in, talk to a company that sells them and get on the phone with them, or you can actually contact ambient support and ask them that as well. They'll give you the exact model numbers you need. Now, the thing is, it sounds like what you're trying to do is get one for every type of camera so that no matter what kind of shooting you do or what kind of job you work in the future, you'll be set with the cable. It's going to be complicated. Once you get to Red cameras, it depends on the model of Red as to which cable you need. It gets complicated. So unfortunately, that's the reality of the world that we work in. But what I would typically do is I don't have all the cables. I have a BNC in and out cable so I can work with my Zoom F8, F8N, and F4. I also can use that with the Ursa Mini Pro. I have several of the 3.5 millimeter cameras so I can use with the Ursa or the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera. And then you just have to find out what each of the other cameras do as well. So for example, on the C300, I believe, maybe someone in the chat knows, but I think that's a BNC. I'm not positive. But you just want to look up the specs for each of them. I'm sorry I don't have all the answers for all of those right now, but that's the kind of the short answer or the way you can go about finding out which cable you need. Another consideration too, and I think what a lot of people do, is that they Oh man, I don't know if you saw that. Let me change back to that. I apologize. I think I hit the wrong button there. Let's go back and show you that. So here's the spot on the, for those that didn't see it before, on the ambient website. You can see there are a ton of them. So yes, the one thing to be careful of is make sure you get the correct direction on the cable, and then also make sure you get the kind that, with the right connector for the camera you're trying to attach to. One thought. Let me just go back to the thought I was thinking about here. That is to say that a lot of times the way you may want to consider doing this is build up your kit of cables over time and charge the production when they're using a camera that you don't already have a cable for. That's how typically the billing is done. You usually charge for kit, and if there's something you have to buy to provide the services on that particular job, you then buy that cable, and that's part of the budget. That's part of the quote that you give them. So there are some thoughts there, and rather than try and walk through each of the individuals, I think you're best off contacting one of the sound houses like Gotham Sound, or going to B&H or someone like that, and they can kind of help walk you through that. All right, next up from J.H. Brooks, can you do a walkthrough from the original capture through post-production of how to record using automix on the Zoom F4? A typical scenario would be a 2 or 3 person interview with lav mics. Thanks for all you do to keep us educated and informed. Okay, here. Let me just switch over. This is kind of maddening because Keynote kind of steals the whole screen. Okay, we're back on the screen, I think. Zoom F4. There are a couple things. So I think a lot of people are confused about how automix works. What I would typically recommend is if you're going to be recording this and you want some flexibility to be able to remix it in post if you need to, I would set up your Zoom F4, F8, or F8N, they're all the same in this regard, to record both the isolated and the left-right mix. And you do that in the SD menu. I believe it's the SD card. No, it's not in the SD card. It's in the record menu, excuse me, or the rec play. And it's called rec to SD1 and rec to SD2. I would choose the option for track 1 through 6 or 1 through 8, depending on which F-series you're using, plus LR, polywave. So what that's going to do is all in one big polywave file, it's going to record each of the individual microphone inputs to their own track, plus a left and right stereo track. And the left and right stereo track will be the auto mix that the F-series does. Next, you will go into the input menu on your Zoom F-series. All the way to the very bottom, there's an option for auto mix. And then you turn auto mix on for the inputs that you're going to be auto mixing. So if, for example, you have 3 lavalier microphones and you have them hooked up to inputs 1 through 3, you would turn auto mix on for 1 through 3. Then when you record, what you will get is you will get a wave file. The wave file will have, the first 2 tracks will be the stereo mix, the left and right channels. That will be the auto mixed part of your overall recording. And then you'll have the isolated tracks. You'll have one for input 1, microphone 1, one for microphone 2, one for microphone 3. So what you would normally do, if you're happy with the way that the auto mix turned out, you could just mute the other 3 and you're good to go. That's all you have to do. If, on the other hand, you aren't happy with that mix, you can mute the stereo mix and then do your own mixing job in post with the 3 isolated microphone input channels that were recorded to the polywave file. So that's the general idea. And we do... No, actually we don't. Never mind. So that's a general idea. I hope that kind of clarifies what you were looking for there. So let's head on back to this. Okay. Nevi, I would like to ask about sound editing. Maybe you made a video about it, but I couldn't find it. When we edit a video with different sound levels, how can we set all the sound files at the same sound level that we hear them equally? Thanks in advance. Greetings from Norway. Actually, let me just stay in there and go back. You would use the match loudness panel. If you're using Adobe Audition, this is a great way to do this. You can literally drop all of your clips into the match loudness panel, choose your loudness standard, click process, and all of them will be processed to the same loudness level. Now, I would, when you're doing that in post and you're getting ready to, you're setting up your mix, I wouldn't get too aggressive. This is where you probably need to drop that loudness target down. So I would probably set it to minus 26 or minus 28 even for while you're doing the mix. And then you can go back in later when you're doing the loudness normalization at the very end, after you've mixed everything, the music, the dialogue, everything else. And that's when you can come in and do the overall loudness to the loudness standard. But you can use this same panel here in Adobe Audition to at least get them all into the same level. And I would usually I would just use the ITR BS1770 preset and then drop the target loudness to something like minus 28. That way, for most dialogue recordings, you're not going to be cutting off any of the transient. You're not going to be clipping off any of the peaks. And then you can go about your mix. So hopefully that makes sense for you there, Nevi. Thanks that's a good question. And then finally from Nick, get back in there. There we go. If you could have any IFB system specifically for a boom operator, what would you get? I worked with a mixer who used Comtex for this, but I didn't feel like the quality was good enough. I know you can use a wireless system like some Sennheiser G3s, but that seems less than ideal also. I have my eye on the Electro IFB T4, and I don't really see all that many other options. Well, I would actually agree with you. That'd be the first place I look. To be honest, I don't usually work the type of productions where we do that, but here is a video from my friend Michael Wynn, who actually walks you through the comm setup he uses, including the feed that he sends to his boom operator. So that would actually be pretty potentially useful for you. He talks about all the gear he uses. He actually does use G3s to transmit from each of the sound departments. So this is going to be like from the utility and the boom op back to the mixer. But he does use the, I believe it is the same exact IFB you were talking about from Electro that he uses. So I'll put a link for this down below, but if you just do a search for Michael Wynn, Wynne, Crew Comms Setup, and that'll give you some really good detailed information. Now, somebody asked this recently as well. How do I set this up? Well, here's a perfect example of that. Note that he has a Sound Devices 688, which is his mixer, and that particular mixer has a comms return input on it. So that makes things a lot easier for him to be able to do that. 633, Zoom F-Series, Mix Pre-Series don't have that, but the Zoom F4 actually does have a camera return, which you could potentially use. So you'll kind of have to adapt it for your situation, but Michael goes and covers that in great detail. So definitely worth checking that out if you haven't already. All right. We have some people in here. I have a thumbs down. All right. I don't know who left a thumbs down, but if you have some feedback, we'd love to hear it. All right. N2, hello. Welcome to the show here, Joel. Hi from Las Vegas. Welcome, Andre. Do you know of a cheap wired XLR lav mic? Yes, Maono. If you do a search for Maono Curtis Judd at YouTube, you'll see the video for that. It's about $35 if I remember correctly. Sounds okay, but it is XLR and it works pretty decently. And Maono is spelled M-A-O-N-O. All right, Mark Owens, great information as usual from Newcastle, Australia. Winter here, midday, 18 degrees Celsius. Stay warm there, buddy. Into go with the Deity ones or Rhodes One Thunder Boom. Not sure what that's in reference to. And Pradeep from India, welcome. Arts, good to have you here. Bangs Naughty Bits. If you set the hold switch on an H4n Pro, does that lock the gain as well? I was amazed the hold switches don't lock the gain on the H6. Interesting. Yeah, so the H1 locks, on the H1, it locks the gain setting. On the H1n, it does not lock it. On the H4n Pro, I don't have one of those handy to test that. My recollection was that it does lock it, but maybe it doesn't. I think it does. And I think the reason it doesn't on the H6 and the H1n Pro is that they have dials to set the gain trim. So I think that's the difference there. Anyone correct me if I'm wrong on that. So, okay. Other things to talk about. If anyone has questions, by all means, go ahead and leave us a question there. We'd love to see what you have to say. A couple of things that I am going to tell you about. I have been working on, this is more of a consumer-oriented piece here, but the Pico gear Pico mic, wireless mic system. We ran into some issues with our GH5, and that's not this thing's fault. It's the GH5, it turns out. But I've been in touch with Pico Gear. There's a reason the review isn't out yet, is I'm still working on it. And we ran into that issue. It turns out that the GH5 is kind of an interesting camera as far as 3.5 millimeter mic input is concerned. It actually is it kind of is tricky because it can be a TRS or TRRS, and it tries to auto-sense, and then other things that you're plugging into it are also trying to auto-sense, and they sometimes get confused. And so what was happening on the Pico Gear is it was trying to figure out what kind of input this was and was switching back and forth, and so we were getting these dropouts. But that was just because it wasn't sure what to do. So what we found is that if you can force it, you can force it into TRS mode, and then it will be just fine. So that was kind of what held us up on the review a little bit. So we were like, what in the world is going on here, and why do I keep getting this weird drop? And that turns out what it was. So thanks to the guys at Pico Gear who helped me kind of troubleshoot that one. So the good news is, relative to some of the other wireless systems out there, this one actually lets you lock in and kind of force it to work in either TRS mode or TRRS mode. So that is something interesting worth considering. So we're still a couple weeks out on that because I had to move some other things up based on dates, so on and so forth. But I have a couple of other things that I'm very excited about. Just keep it on the sound-related side. We won't talk about the lighting things coming up, but the sound-related side, I have something very exciting here for my birthday. And I don't own this. This is on loan, just so you're aware. This is the Sound Devices Scorpio. This is their brand new mixer recorder. And this is a pretty amazing piece of gear. It just arrived today. And we're going to do some testing, obviously, with it. But we're not really going to do a review so much as why do pros use some, gear like this? It's a $9,000 recorder. I would love to have one. I don't quite have the budget for one, nor do I typically work on the large enough projects to really require one. For me, I think probably like a 688 from Sound Devices would be pretty sufficient, but this is pretty interesting. This is, I think, really what I'm looking at this as is kind of their new platform. So it's kind of the launch of the new platform. So they've redesigned the preamplifiers. They now have 76 decibels of gain. So it almost looks like they're not the same preamps as the Mix Pre, of course, but they definitely have more gain than the previous 600 series mixers did, I believe. And Dante, which is kind of a new addition for the Sound Devices mixers here. So those are the RJ45 jacks there. So the idea for those that aren't familiar with Dante is you can have a stage box, for example, it has 32 inputs or 16 inputs, microphone inputs, with the preamplifiers and analog to digital converters sitting out on that stage box. Connect all your mics in there, and then just run a single network cable to the Scorpio, and you can control all of that from this thing. And it's small enough. It's the same size basically as a 688 recorder mixer, and so it can fit in a sound bag, but it has just amazing control, and we'll be taking a closer look at that. All right. Go ahead and turn that off. All right, now we're back over to you guys. Let's take a look here and see if we have any more questions. Okay, Joel has a question here. Starting sound mixer setup for someone with $4,000 budget, recommended mixer, etc. Joel, that really depends, I think, on if you've used any of them before, if you're kind of used to one of them over the other in terms of the overall interface, user interface, and ergonomics. That's one thing to consider. How many inputs you need, that's another thing to consider. The thing I would say, a Sound Device is 633, but the reality with that one is, and that's what I use typically as my main mixer, because that fits the role for most of my jobs. Again, it has 3 microphone inputs, 3 line level inputs in addition to that, so I can get 6 channels in very easily. But if you're going to be doing jobs with a lot more mic inputs, then you're probably going to need to look at something else, obviously. But that's going to take you very quickly. And the 633 is about $3,300 for the mixer alone. That's nothing, that has no batteries, no cables, no microphones, no any of the rest of that. So it probably really doesn't fit into that budget. For me, I think a really great option in what I'm using here tonight to send sound for the session is the MixPre 10T from Sound Devices. That's a great option. That runs about $1,800 US. That leaves plenty of additional for getting a few wireless channels, getting some microphones, getting batteries, and things of that nature. So I would say that's a consideration. That's if you need a fair number of inputs, microphone inputs. So that's going to be 8 XLR-based inputs, plus there is an auxiliary 3.5 millimeter stereo input. That's where you get the 10 from. Has timecode built in, so you've already taken care of timecode for the mixer, at least, if you go with the Sound Devices MixPre 10T. In terms of wireless, that's a little trickier. A lot of people start with the Sennheiser G3, G4s, and they're not bad. They teach you everything you need to know about setting frequencies and things of that nature. They work in close, if you're in relatively good range, they work a little bit better than a lot of the 2.4 gigahertz systems. Those are more, at this point, they're generally more consumer oriented, but with a couple of exceptions. I think the Sennheiser AVX uses a 1.9 gigahertz, I believe. So that's a different frequency range. But I would say probably something like the Sennheiser G3 or G4 is a good starting kit. I know some sound mixers will just cringe at hearing me say that, but if you're working on a budget of $4,000, I think having 2 of those kits would be, I think, a good place to start. As far as microphones are concerned, shotguns, I think the Deity S-Mic 2 would be a decent option as far as the shotgun is concerned. For the indoor boom mic, I really liked the Audio-Technica AT4053B. It's a hypercardioid. It sounds really quite good on most voices, so I found that to be a really versatile mic for a lot of years. So that's a good option on that front. And I think if we did the math, we'd be pretty close to your $4,000 limit, Joel. So there's some thoughts there. Now, of course, you can go on the, you can save money on the mixer. You could go with a Zoom F8N. That'll give you 8 microphone inputs. The ergonomics are a little different on that one. And I think that there are some people out there making a living with their Zoom F8. There's what is his name? I apologize here. He goes by Sound Speed on YouTube and a lot of other places. I think Iron Film. I think that's the same person. I'm not 100% positive, but he used for the longest time a Zoom F4, and within the last year or so upgraded to a Zoom F8N. So he's making a living doing that. So people do that, and I think the Zoom F series are great recorders in terms of the quality of their preamplifiers. I prefer the MixPre a little bit better in terms of the sound of their preamps, but that's not something that most people are going to notice. Most audiences are going to notice the difference between those two. It's got lots of gain. It's got, it's very clean, so there's plenty of headroom. It doesn't have the analog limiters that the MixPre has, but it does have a hybrid limiter. I'm not as enthused about those, but they do the job generally. So, if you set your gain correctly, your gain trim, you're generally not going to hit your limiters a whole lot anyway. So as long as you know what you're doing, you can, again, make great recordings with that. It has an inbuilt timecode generator on both the F4 and the F8, or F8N, so you've got that taken care of if you need that. And then what I would do is really, when that takes you up to your budget, you just rent the rest of the stuff and you charge your clients for it when you get those jobs. So there's some thoughts there on that one. All right. They've got something here from Peter. Greetings from Montana. Great channel. You mentioned before you also have a sibilant voice. I appear to be the king in this regard, having trouble dialing in my de-esser. Even by sweeping the frequency, can you step through your process by any chance? Let's see here. The trick is I can't send audio right now with the way I'm set up from Audition. I do cover that in one of my courses. I'm trying to think if I have a free video out there that covers that as well. But in any case, let me open up Audition here and show you some things that may be helpful for you. Let me just jump over to the screen here. Okay. Let me open up. I'm going to need a file here. All right. Let's just say, technically, this is not actually even dialogue, but just for the process of showing you here, under Effects, Amplitude, and Compression, there's a de-esser. We'll just use this one for now. What you can do is click this box here that says Output Sibilance Only. I know it's probably hard to see at the resolution we're shooting in there, and I don't have the ability. Well, maybe I do have the ability to zoom in. Nope, not there. Okay, in any case, trust me here, I'm just going to read the names. So there's a checkbox here that says Output Sibilance Only. Once you have done that, then you can, I would select multiband, and then I would move the center frequency around until you start hearing a lot of the sibilants. What will happen is it'll essentially mute everything except for the sibilant frequencies that you have selected. So as you move that center frequency around, once you start to hear the really strong S's coming through, then uncheck the Output Sibilance Only and change your threshold until you get to the sound you want. That's the general process for working with a de-esser. So hopefully that's helpful for you. And let's come back over here and see what other questions we have now. Let's close that for now. Okay. So thanks for that, Peter. That's a great question. All right. Next up. Waiting for your review of the Rode compact mic, which you showed on one of your last videos. Yes, so I think this is what you're talking about. Let's confirm. That's a big stack of the stuff I need to review. Rode TF5. So this is actually more for music recording. TF stands for Tony Faulkner. Tony Faulkner is a recording engineer. He mostly works on classical music recordings. And this set of microphones, it actually is sold in a set. Let's see, we have two. It's a stereo matched pair. They are cardioid microphones. I actually used one of them on my last video. The Onset Sound Lingo video was actually me recording or talking into one of these. So I had a chance to, my brother and I, Carrie, had a chance to bring in a harp player, and we did some recordings with this. And from my perspective, they sound beautiful. We made some mistakes or kind of learned some lessons, I guess you will, if you will. I'm not actually a sound recordist for music typically, or a recording engineer for music. So I don't have a ton of experience. I understand, of course, that mic placement is a very critical thing, especially when you're working with an instrument like a harp. And that's definitely true. I can tell you that. We move those mics all over the place. And it's really interesting how, with a harp in particular, it's kind of like you're recording the harp in the room. And the overall sound signature is defined by the room, by the harp, where it's located in the room, and where the mics are located in relation to the harp. So you don't necessarily, for more kind of naturalistic recordings of harp, you don't necessarily want to be spot miking right up on the instrument itself. You want to move it back a little bit and let the room also become part of the overall sound in that case. So I was pretty happy with the way the sound came out. Of course, one of the rookie mistakes we made is also a video recording session. And so one of the lights had a fan on it. And we did our best to eliminate all the fans in the room we could. We had a recorder attached to the camera, and we turned that off, which we could. But we needed the light. So unfortunately, a little of that bled into this kind of you really can't, I can't hear it at least until the harp stops playing. And we kind of let it sustain out its nose. And then once the sustain kind of dies off, you can hear the fan from the light. So there's a lesson learned. Use lights without fans, and that's going to be pretty important. So I don't know that we're going to necessarily do a whole review of this, but maybe more of a demonstration with it. They're not cheap. They're about $1,500 for the pair, which actually for a matched pair, It's not the highest end and it's not the lowest end, somewhere in the middle, like Rode typically is. So, but anyway, I've been very happy with these. They sound really good. I wouldn't necessarily choose to use these for recording dialogue, however. Um, you could for the right voices, but it does seem to have a little bit of a presence peak in the higher frequencies. So for sibilant voices, it's not going to be the best choice. It seemed to pick up a little bit of the mouth noise, and partly that's microphone placement, but partly it's also just how that microphone is particularly tuned for recording that type of music. So, all right. Let's just see here. I'm just scrolling back here to make sure I got everyone. Great to see the Scorpio in your hands. It's great to see the Scorpio in my hands. I think so too. Um, I'm considering that my birthday present, just to have a couple weeks to work with it on loan. So that's pretty cool. And Joshua reported nice. I think that was in regards to the same thing. Blue Streak Science. Hello, all. Welcome to our session here. Joel says, thank you. I'm an assistant editor living in Las Vegas, and I discovered a passion for sound while assistant editing. Yes, it's cool to see someone move over from editorial. Joel. Peter VR says, thank you. Joel, again, a big part of my job is temp dialogue editing and sound editing. I realized I'm good at it and enjoy it, so I'm looking to getting into sound mixing since there's a lack of sound mixers in Las Vegas. Good. That's great to see. And then Blue Streak says, after fires in Northern California 2017, I had to purchase all new gear. Your light and sound tutorial has been instrumental in getting our podcast back on the air. Thanks a million. Well, glad to see you back too then. Those were pretty devastating fires, as we all know. And glad to see you're getting your kit back up and working. All right. Diani Darker. Theoretically, 24-bit audio has 144 dB. If you buy a recorder that has an EIN, or the equivalent input noise, of minus 127 dBu, does it mean that 17 dB of self-emitting noise? So first of all, EIN is a calculated figure, and usually it's not. I've not usually seen the specs say minus 127 dB or something like that. Usually they say the spec is something like the kind of on the low end. I see things in the like maybe 3 to 4 dB up to, it's not uncommon to see even professional mics with even in the kind of 16 dB range. So that's usually how I see equivalent input noise quoted in specs. So to be honest, we're out of my league. I don't know the answer to that. I will say this, that when you are recording with a high quality microphone preamplifier and analog to digital converter with 24-bit recording, that it's usually going to be the microphone that you're going to be hearing in terms of self-noise. It's not the preamp. So anything like a Zoom F4 and up, a mix pre from Sound Devices and up, it's not going to be the preamp that's going to be giving you the noise. It's going to be the microphone. So I'm not sure how that calculation works exactly. So sorry about that, but it's a good question. All right, a question from Thomas. Sorry if it's been asked. Speaking of stacks of stuff for reviews, is a full review of the Zoom F6 on your schedule? Thanks. Yes, it is. I have pre-ordered the Zoom F6, so after that comes in and we get a little bit of time to work with it, we definitely are planning to do a review. I want to talk about that for just a little bit because I think I put out my initial impressions piece on the Zoom F6, and I interviewed Samuel Green from Zoom at NAB this year. And in part of that, we did a demonstration, not the interview on the NAB show floor, but the first impressions video. Basically, I recorded so that when I brought the waveform into Adobe Audition, you couldn't see anything. We boosted it by, I can't remember, it was about 58 dB or something like that, and suddenly you had this beautiful waveform, and the noise performance was still incredible. The self-noise performance was still incredible. The noise floor was sitting down at a very acceptable level, below minus, I think it was about minus 70 dB or somewhere around there. Usually I'm kind of, my rule of thumb kind of target is minus 60 dB for the noise floor. And that's a really impressive thing. And that was kind of what I was trying to to go for is to say, hey, this is a really interesting, different, and new way to approach things, for Zoom at least. Other higher-end manufacturers have already done it, Zaxcom in particular. I believe Sonosax does something similar. But I want to clarify one thing. You can actually do something very similar with the Sound Devices Mix Pre. You can record way, way lower with tons and tons of headroom and then boost it in post by 50 dB and still get a very clean recording. So it's not as if the Zoom F6 has a corner on that market. And the advantage with the Mix Pre is that you can set the gain trim. On the F6, you can't. You just get a unity gain and that's it. So that's just something to consider here. So for people, and I've actually had people say, hey, should I upgrade my Mix Pre 6 or Mix Pre 3 to a Zoom F6? And my answer is no. I don't see it as an upgrade. I see it as that would definitely be a cross grade. And in fact, from my perspective, for general purpose, I think the Zoom F6 is a little bit more special purpose, but for general purpose, I would stick with your Zoom F4, F8, Mix Pre 3, Mix Pre 6, Mix Pre 10, because I think they're much better all-purpose mixers in terms of the ergonomics of them. The F6 is really, really small, so if really small is like at the top of your priority list, then yeah, okay, it's a good choice. But I don't see it otherwise as an upgrade really to the Mix Pre series or the F8, even the F8 or the F4. If you're doing more kind of general purpose stuff, then I would stick with what you've got. So that's just some thoughts there on the Zoom F6. Don't get me wrong, I'm excited about the Zoom F6. I think it's a really interesting direction that Zoom is taking, but I don't think it's the end-all be-all and that you should dump all of your other gear and go buy one of those. So just some thoughts there. Here is a thought. I like using right angle connectors on my cables to keep things tidy and not sticking out on my desk. Is this a problem? What about using right angle XLR extenders? No, I don't think that's a problem at all. If you have good connections and they're made out of good materials, I don't think there's any sort of cost to that really at all. So I agree. A lot of times in the bags, it helps. It makes things a lot easier to work with. So those right angle connectors can be really helpful. All right, Peter has another question. One more, if I may, regarding sibilance. Any mics you prefer or avoid for a problematic voice in this regard? My Sennheiser MKE600 is much better than my Audio-Technica 4040, though much prefer the Audio-Technica otherwise. Interesting, okay. There are a lot of microphones out there. Wow, what do I say? I'm not sure where to start because again, there are so many options out there. I can tell you one thing. I don't love. Here's one thing. A lot of production sound mixers really love the Schoeps CMC 641, and indeed, it's a great microphone. It sounds great on so many people's voices. But there are people with a lot of sibilance in their voice that I don't like to use that microphone. And I think a lot of production sound mixers are that way as well. They like to have options. But that would be one that I would avoid. That's a little bit on the higher end. Those are about $1,600 or $1,700 US. So that's one I would probably stay away from for your particular voice. And that's why I don't typically use it on my voice much. I really like the Sennheiser MKH8050. This is a mic I use for indoor booming. You can see it. It's this little guy here. This is a super cardioid, and that one works pretty nicely. I found that sometimes and different people have different opinions about this, but the MKH416 from Sennheiser can be a little harsh for people that have really sibilant voices, so that's something to keep in mind. I'm not sure. I mean, we could talk all night about microphones, so there are some thoughts there. But if you're looking for, I don't know if you're looking for a large diaphragm condenser, because I think that's what the Audio-Technica 4040 is. I think the MK600 is a shotgun mic, so I'm not sure. It sounds like maybe you're doing more voiceover. But one mic I do like for sibilant voices, for voiceover, large diaphragm condenser, is the, I'm not going to pull it out, it's down here, but it's the AKG C414 XLS. So not the regular C414, but the XLS version, which is supposed to have a flatter frequency response, and I find it does work definitely better for people that have the kind of sibilant voice. So there's some thoughts there. All right. Joel asks, would you recommend a new S-Mic 2 or a used NTG3? Personally, of those two, for a long-term investment, I'd go with the NTG3. That's all. It has I think, well, different people will disagree with me, and that's fine. But my preference would be for the NTG3. I think the NTG3 is an RF bias technology mic. I think it's going to hold up better for you in a lot of situations. It's a really tough mic. It really will continue to work even in humid conditions, whereas some of the other mics, the S-Mic 2 has the waterproofing in it, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to sound good if it gets really wet, whereas the NTG3 will generally hold up better in those kind of situations. So there's some thoughts there, Joel. All right, Thomas, has Zoom clarified how the preamps and DACs are set up? No, I think partly that's going to be their intellectual property that they don't want to reveal all the details on. But it's my understanding that they have the same exact preamps, I'm told from Samuel, as the Zoom F4, Zoom F8, and Zoom F8N. And that then they employ two analog to digital converters that take, stepping back, the same exact preamp except that there's no gain trim, user settable gain trim. It's set to a unity gain, which is a very low gain, kind of its optimal level of gain. And then it puts the two analog to digital converters on there. One of them takes a higher amplitude, one of them takes a lower amplitude, part of the overall bandwidth. And they have some sort of crossover in the middle. This is where the magic and the secret sauce comes in. And the two of them handle the overall dynamic range that preamplifier is capable of capturing. So, the dynamic range. So they haven't given us a lot more detail than that. So there's some thoughts there. Blue Streak Science, those preamps on my MixPre 6 have made post-production so much easier. I agree. That's one of the things I really love about the MixPre series, as those preamps do work pretty nicely. The analog limiters work nicely, and so makes it easy in post, so that's great. And then Pradeep, thanks for the clarification regarding the MixPre 3.6 versus the Zoom F6. And we'll probably be putting together a specific video where we demonstrate that. I just feel like I wanted to demonstrate that because that's kind of the cool new feature with the Zoom F6 in terms of their marketing. And indeed, it looks like it holds up pretty nicely. Some people were complaining that they felt like the sound samples that we had to boost by almost 60 dB sounded a little grainier. And it could be that it's, that's going to happen. But yeah, you just understanding how preamps work in general for these newer devices like the MixPre 3 and 6 and 10, there really is a lot of headroom in those. And so I think a lot of times we get worried about things in terms of specs that don't necessarily translate to the real world. So just some things to keep in mind there. All right, we have come to the end of another very exciting Sound for Video session. Thanks all for joining. Thanks for those that submitted their questions ahead of time. Get out there and make some great sound, and we'll talk to you again soon.